Hello Internet, and welcome to a new tutorial. The Behringer Neutron today is one of the most interesting semi-modular synthesizers you can find on the market. It's cheap, it's flexible, and can create a wide range of sounds, and it's definitely becoming my go-to synthesizer when it comes to experimental sound design. And I think that's not the case only for me, but for a lot of people. But beside going wild with it, the Behringer Neutron is one of these rare synthesizers capable of creating fat and warm analog bass lines. And I feel, at least from what I read on the internet, that it's one of the most underestimated sides of the Behringer Neutron, especially when it comes to Psytrance bass lines, right? So today I want to change that. I want to show you how I create my bass lines with it and how I process them, whether it's in Ableton or in Bitwig. And please remember, I am not one of these guys that'll tell you analog is good, digital is bad. I love both, and I think both has something special to offer to us, and I try to get the best out of both of them. But before we dive into this tutorial, if you'd like to support the channel, you can consider becoming one of my patrons, buy my presets on Gumroad, or just leave a like, comment, subscribe if you like content like this. Now, with that said, let's dive into this tutorial. Okay, so first thing first, let's create the bassline on the Neutron. So we'll hop to my desk over there and we'll create it together. Let's do this. Okay, so here's the Neutron, and what we're going to do, we will use the LFO here as our source of oscillation instead of these two main oscillators, because the LFO can be retriggered every time it receives a new note, meaning that the phase will be reset to 0. And this is really important when we're dealing with Psytrance basslines. Now I know that we will eventually record the output, put it in a sampler, etc., but the LFO just gives us a little bit more flexibility than the oscillators, and also it has a couple of shapes that the oscillators doesn't have. See, the oscillator, we have only a ramp up saw. For the LFO, we have a ramp down and a ramp up. And for sure, you can use whatever you like, but for me, I'm going with the LFO. Okay, so how are we going to do this? We will take the bipolar output of the LFO and it'll go to the VCF input. So now we're bypassing the oscillators and the LFO is going directly to the VCF and then to the VCA, basically, going through the overdrive too. Now, what we will do, we'll set the LFO to a ramp down like this, and now we need it to key track and sync to our note, right? So I know that the bass line of this example is in G sharp. So what I'm going to do, we need to hit key sync like this. Now, we hit key track, we play the note, we release key track, and then we release the note, okay? In this order. So hit key track, play the note, release key track, stop playing the note. Okay, and now all what we have to do is tune the LFO with the rate knob in here. Let's take it off from the tuning mode, and now let's tune it up. Okay, perfect. See, it's not perfect and we still have this analog mojo, even though as far as I know the LFO is digital in the Neutron. Okay, now let's start designing our bassline. So how I'm going to do it, I'll play an offbeat bassline note, and this will gives us a bit more flexibility actually to do it instead of the classic triplets, right? Because since we're dealing with the Neutron and we have MIDI latency and the envelopes aren't as precise as Serum or Vital or whatever, using an offbeat note to create and sound design the bassline will just give us the flexibility we're looking for. And anyways, as I mentioned, we're going to record these basslines and put them in a sampler. So we don't need to be a millisecond precise, on the release, the sustain, etc., because we can then rework it in the sampler. So let's do just so. So first of all, I'll go with the saw ramp down like this. Now to make the LFO, our oscillator now retrigger, we have to just press key sync like this, and now it'll retrigger. And always when you're working with basslines, check out the scope and the frequency analyzer. Always, always, always work with these. So check this out, now the phase is being retriggered. Perfect, let's take down the sustain, like so, give it some decay. See, on the scope we have a lot of release, but that's okay, we're going to take that out in the sampler. Now let's close the filter like so. Always leave a little bit of the frequencies bleeding from the filter, like don't close it all the way down, just leave a little bit bleeding, right? And now what I'll do, I'll just open it with the second envelope. Okay, perfect. Now we have the overdrive circuit in here, and as you can see, I didn't bypass it unlike I do with almost all of my other Neutron tutorials. Why? Because the overdrive circuit in this example helps us shape the bassline. So for now, I won't take it out, and I'm going to play with the tone so you will see what's going on with the bassline when I'll just play with it. See, we don't really need to really overdrive it and distort it. We can just use the tone as some sort of a secondary filter that will just help us shape the bassline, right? And that's pretty much it for the basic sound design of the bassline of the Neutron. Now what I'm going to do, I'll just sample it and we'll continue working with it inside of the computer. But before I do this, always remember to record your hardware synthesizers and effects as loud as possible, or as we call it, as hot as possible, because like this, you will almost eliminate any risk of having unnecessary noise coming from the cables, the synthesizer, your sound cards, preamp, whatever. Just try to record as hot as possible. Now, let's get back to the computer. Okay, so here we are in Bitwig, and I've just recorded a couple of octaves from Neutron. So what we're going to do, we'll just slice them into a drum machine, and we will just play them from over there, right? So what I did, first of all, I've recorded a note I've left the space between the note, which is equivalent to a quarter of a bar. This is not only enough for the release time of the notes, we'll get the Neutron enough release and we won't cut that release, but it will simplify the whole process of slicing these notes to a new drum machine. So let me show you how we will do it. We will double click on our clip in here, right? So what I'll do, I'll take this clip from here and I'll set it to start at the beginning, right at the beginning. The start of the sample will be right at the beginning of the clip. So I'll just set it in here, like so. Perfect. Now, we're not exactly on the grid for all of the notes. That's because of the limitation of the MIDI format, but that's not of a big deal. We will correct that inside of the drum machine, even if we don't slice them exactly, at these, zero crossing points, right? So what we will do in here, so this is our clip. I will just make it shorter like this. And now what we're going to do, before we slice it, we have to bounce it out. And this is really important. Like so, we will get rid of all of these extra, emptiness in here. And we will make sure that Bitwig will slice exactly on point. And this goes the same for Ableton, by the way. So let's bounce it out. Perfect. And now what I'll do, I'll just right click in here, slice to a drum machine, and we'll slice it raw like so. There's no pitch shifting, BPM correction algorithm involved or anything, and we'll slice it to 1/4 of a note. Now we'll hit OK, and Bitwig just created this drum machine for us with all of these notes, right? The notes goes from C1 to B2, right? Let's put this channel in its place. Okay, sweet. So here's our drum machine, and I've already set a pattern here of G sharp notes. So we should have a rolling G sharp bass line. Perfect. And here's our note. Now, you should do this manually for each of the notes, but I'll just do it for one for the sake of the tutorial to make it just easier, simpler. We'll just zoom in and make sure that we're starting on the zero crossing. See this beginning in here of the note? I don't want it. I want to start at this zero crossing in here. So I'll just hit the snap to zero crossing thing off, and I'll set it right in here. So now we have this. So we have a cleaner bass line. Like in here, it was not that clean. Like it had a clicky character to it, and I just want to get rid of this clickiness. We can add it later on, but yeah, this, I don't want it. Okay, perfect. Now what I'll do, I'll take this release off. You know, it's going to leave by default 10 milliseconds of release, and that's more than enough. And what I'll do, I'll right click in here and I'll copy value to all 23 layers, like so they will all have the same release time, right? Perfect. Now we have this. And now, as the usual, always work with the scope, so we'll see exactly what's going on. So let's open the scope. Perfect. We can make it a little bit shorter like this. And for sure, this, you have to do it for all of the notes, but I'm not doing it just for the sake of keeping the tutorial on point. Perfect. Now that you have this, next step for me is controlling the low end. As you can hear, the Neutron has a really fat low end to it. So we want to control that a little bit, right? So I'll do this with a simple EQ. I'll just add it in here. Let's close this, EQ plus. You know, I will keep this tutorial limited to only devices from Ableton and Bitwig, you know, native ones. I won't go in details and like use Saturn or, you know, whatever external device. If you would like to go in details on how to create a proper Psytrance bassline, I already did a full masterclass on that. You can check it out on my Gumroad. Now let's get back to the tutorial. So the EQ, I'll set the equalizer in here, the resolution to huge, right? So now we can see exactly all of the frequencies that we're dealing with. See, and I want to take these ones down a little bit, you know. I'll set it to a low shelf. Low shelf is best when dealing with bass lines. Like when you will add a low cut or basically like a high pass filter, you will just destroy the phase basically. And we don't want to do this inside of the equalizer. We'll do it later on, but not inside of the equalizer. So we always go with a low shelf like this. Perfect. If you would like, you can take down some of the mids. But that really depends on the bassline that you're working with. Now, after the equalizer, we need some multiband processing, right? And the multiband processing is the processing that will actually create some phase distortion, and we will use this to add character to the bassline, okay? So there's a couple of ways to do it inside of Bitwig. We can either use the EQ DJ, like this. And then we will play with the crossings, right? But using the EQ DJ is a little bit of a hassle because then we have to group it, duplicate it, and create 3 channels, one for the lows, one for the mids, one for the highs, if we want to apply any processing to these channels, right? And this is a little bit of a hassle, as I mentioned. So actually Bitwig thought of that, and you know, the developers of Bitwig, and they've added a device called Multiband 3. And this multiband FX does exactly what we're doing with the EQ DJ for us. And this is exactly the same thing that we create in Filter Saturn, or, you know, some people prefer using Wave C4 or, you know, whatever. So Now we have a device that is splitting the signal into basically three elements. I think the slopes in here are 12 decibels per octave. I mean, at least on the scope, they look like 12 decibels per octave slopes. And now we can add whatever we like as processing to the low band, to the mid band, to the high band. And we don't need to create this FX layer like I did with the EQ DJ in here, right? So now, since we can apply whatever effects we want to the low, mid, and high, we can either add some saturation, for example. I think the saturator of Bitwig sounds really good on bassline. Like, you have to use it, you have to be really careful when using it because like it can distort the sound easily. But I think it adds a really nice touch to the bassline. For sure, we take off this low pass in here on the input and we can add a little bit of warmth to the sound. But I think the sound is more than warm, but this is, always a nice option to have if you're recording another synthesizer, which is not the Neutron, you can use it, to add some warmth. Or if you just want to go crazy and add a lot of, distortion to the low end, you can do so. Or what I prefer doing is emulating the OTT inside of Bitwig. And Bitwig excels in this because there's this device called Dynamics, right? In Bitwig. And this device actually, well, it's a compressor. Basically, it can do upward compression and downward compression at the same time. Now, I can put it on the lows, the mids, and the highs, and I can emulate what OTT is doing because basically OTT is applying upward and downward compression at the same time, right? So let's duplicate it on the lows, the mids, and the highs. Let's set the crossfades in here to what we need. What I usually like to do is leave at least the first couple of harmonics, inside of the low bands. And the mids, I like to keep it like between 3K and 5K, depending on the material. And the high is the rest, basically. Something like this should be good. Now let's add some compression. I'll start with the mids. And what I'm going to do, I'll add a bite to the mids, right? And I'll do so with the upward compression, basically. And to set this, it's really simple. Let's set the ratio to the right. Take the ratio up a little bit. Let's play with the attack and the release. Pretty interesting, right? Let's get back to the EQ in here. Take down some of the mids. And now emphasize them with the dynamics a little bit. Pretty interesting. And if we would like to go, a bit more adventurous, if that makes sense, there's a second compression stage inside of the dynamics that we can actually use to recompress if we want, So let's try it out. We can go really crazy with it, I'll just keep it to something like just a tiny bit of compression because I think it controls the mids better like this, And before we had this, now we have this. See how the mids changed? The difference is like between night and day, I think this is huge. Okay, now I think the bassline is in a really good place. We can apply just a tiny bit of compression to the low end because I think it's a little bit way too much. So I'll just do so with the dynamics of the low end in here. But really just a tiny bit. See, just gave it a little bit more precision, like just a tiny bit. We don't need to go hard on this one, you know? And as the usual, just put it there and start experimenting, you know? And if you need some help, my masterclass is there for you. Anyways, now what we can do with the bass line, if we would like to go a little bit, you know, on the extreme side of things, we can duplicate this multi-band effects in here, right? But we won't leave it with the mix all the way up. We'll take the mix down. So now we'll just take advantage of the phase distortion that it's adding to the sound. So we'll get this. Now listen to the difference when it's off and when it's on. It really depends on the bassline that you're trying to create. Sometimes it's better with, sometimes it's better without. In this case, I think it's better without, but I'll keep it just to show you a little trick, because now that I kept it, you can hear how we've affected the transient. It's almost non-existent, right? So I want to bring that back. And how to do so? Really simple. Here in Bitwig, since the last update, we have the transient split, right? So we can just add it in here. And what we can do is just solo the transient, make sure that it's really detecting what we want from it. Maybe play with the decay a little bit. Unsolo it, and now we can add just a tiny bit of gain to bring that transient back up. Without, with, yeah, a bit less. This is really one of the amazing updates that has been added to Bitwig. And yeah, in a nutshell, this is how I go about processing the bassline inside of Bitwig using only processing from Bitwig's devices. And speaking of devices, I've actually created several devices containing several basslines from the Neutron. These devices are available for Bitwig and Ableton, and you can go check them out on my Gumroad, and I think this is one of the best way that you can support me to make more of these tutorials. So go check them out and bring that, Neutron analog warmth, to your tracks. Okay, so here am I during editing, and I've just realized I didn't talk about something really important, which is the bass notes overlapping with the kick. So all of this processing that we've added to the bass line, it created phase shift and phase distortion, and this actually made the notes a little bit longer, right? Meaning that the last note now overlaps a little bit with the kick, like you can see it here on the scope. And this will affect the transient of the kick. It'll make it less precise, like we will hear it less, right? So there's a really quick fix for that, and I want to show you how we can make it using only stock plugins in both Bitwig and Ableton. So in Bitwig, it's really easy. It goes like this. Let's take a tool device. On the tool device in here, I'll go to the modulator section and I'll take a note sidechain, right? So the note sidechain, unlike a classic sidechain, the classic sidechain need audio basically to start working. And here it needs MIDI. And this actually gives us a full ADSR. It gives us more flexibility because basically you're just triggering an envelope with the incoming MIDI. So the simplest way to configure it is to make it takes the MIDI note of the kick, right? So I'll set it like this. So now every time we have a kick, or basically we have a MIDI triggering the kick device, basically, it'll trigger this envelope that we have in here. So if I'll set it to 0 attack, really fast decay, no sustain, no release, and I'll make it affect the volume of the tool device in here, make it go all the way down, check what we will have on the scope. See, it took down all of the overlapping section of the bass line. And this actually is way more precise than the classic audio sidechain. Okay, my intervention is done. Let's get back to the tutorial and I'll show you how to do the same thing inside of Ableton. Okay, so here we are in Ableton, and I've just skipped the part, where I've sliced the recorded samples from a Nitron to a drum machine. It's exactly the same way I did it in Bitwig. Luckily both of them are really similar when it comes to slicing samples. And just like in Bitwig, what I did is start the sample from the zero crossing point in here, exactly like in Bitwig. And the only difference is in here, we only have a fade out. We don't have a full ADSR. So we need to look at the scope in here and just make sure that the samples doesn't clash with the kicks transient in here, okay? So just make it shorter a little bit. Like this, it's good. And if we need to fix that later on, we can add an LFO tool from Xfer and just, duck it, or maybe sidechain compression, just whatever you like. And when it comes to Ableton, always set the slices to gate, because when they're set to trigger, it's going to play all of the sample. And since I've recorded bigger samples just to make sure to get everything, if I leave it on trigger, the samples will just like start eating each other and clashing with each other's, and we don't want that. So yeah, make sure it's on gate. Now, when it comes to processing inside of Ableton, we can either use the DJ EQ technique that I just showed you in Bitwig. Basically, in Ableton, it's the EQ3. We have to, the same thing, group it. And we have to create 3 chains, just like I did in Bitwig. And the thing is, every chain you will mute, like for example, the first one is for the lows, you will mute the mids and highs. Middle one is for the mids, so you will mute lows and highs. The last one is for the highs, so we will mute the lows and the mids. And why I went a little bit in details for this one, it's because EQ3 inside of Ableton has 2 slopes, has 48 and 24 decibels slope, right? And this is actually really interesting because it gives us, by default, a couple of flavors. Like in Bitwig, what I did with the processing at the end is that I've duplicated the multiband effects, and this gave us basically the same effect as having a 48 decibels per octave slope, right? So using the EQ3 gives you that, right from the beginning. To be honest, I don't advise doing it, right in one EQ3. I prefer duplicating, but if you want to go lazy, you can do it. So yeah, after that, we need to set all of the frequency low in here, basically the crossover frequency. We have to set it to 1 macro. Same goes for the high frequency. And now we basically have something similar to the multiband effects that we had, in Bitwig. Now we can, change the crossover frequencies in here and, get the shape we're looking for, like this. So I'll set it to 24. I think it's better. And now we can add whatever processing we would like to these chains, right? But what's interesting in Ableton and makes it a little bit easier to create these bassline with it than in Bitwig, like you have less basically processing to do, is that we have ODT already inside of Ableton. So if I'll just go to multiband dynamics in here, we will add it, and voila. We have our multiband compression already there in place. What's interesting in here is that we can play with the amount, right? And we can do some really extreme things with it. Like, for example, we can take down all of the highs, we can take down a little bit of the mids, and we can, I don't know, like compress them a lot. And add just a tiny bit of it. Like this is 100%. And now we add just a tiny bit of it, right? And just like with Bitwig, we can duplicate that, but with 0 amount, just so we'll get double the phase distortion, right? And what we can do, basically, we can group these multiband compressors, right? And we can route the lows to the first macro in here, both of them. the highs to the second macro. Now we have full control over the phase distortion we're creating. Now, for sure in here, I went right away to the multiband distortion and I didn't do any EQing. Just like with Bitwig, we're going to EQ a little bit. Inside of Ableton, we don't have a lot of choice when it comes to, EQ8. It's here. It does it really well, So we'll just take a little bit, some of these lower frequencies. And here I'm really not trying to be precise. I'm just trying to show you how I go about the process, but for sure, spend some time, fine tweaking the EQ and get, the best results possible. No. Sounds better like this. Perfect. Now, let's take that down. Now, just like with Bitwig, the second multiband dynamics in here kind of killed the transient of the bassline, right? Even though it made the mids a little bit more aggressive. Now, what we can do to bring that transient back up? Now, in Ableton, there's a different way to do it, and it's with the glue compressor. And actually, it does a fine job, in getting that transient back up. So what we're looking for in here, kind of like a slow attack, right? And a fast release. For now, I'll set the attack to 3. It's basically 3 milliseconds, if I'm not mistaken. And the release in here to 0.4, right? And we're going for, I don't know, 3-4 decibels of gain reduction, no more than that, right? Now check this out. I think I'm going around 3.5, something like that. So I'll set the makeup to 3 for now. So before we had this, after we have this. See how it brought that transient back up? You can change the attack time for sure and fine tweak it to your liking. Yeah, I think faster attack is better. And we can go with a faster release too. I think I'm compressing a bit way too much. See how it brought that transient back the way it should be? And yeah, by the way, in a nutshell, this is how you use a compressor to just pump the transient a little bit. Like you leave the attack to something slow and you go with kind of like a fast release. It really depends on the material. Like in here, it's a bassline, so I went with a fast release. But, for other material, you can go with a slower release. It really depends. Okay, now back to me during editing. So to fix the overlapping notes problem inside of Ableton, since we don't have the same devices as Bitwig and the same flexibility Bitwig has, we're going to go with the classic sidechain compression technique, So to do it, actually, we're going to use the glue compressor in here. I think it works best. So what I'll do, just like I did with Bitwig, I'm going to duplicate the glue compressor in here. And I'm going to, well, first of all, it's going to stop compressing. The makeup will go to 0 in here. I'll set it to sidechain mode, right? And I'll make it take the input from the kick in here. Let's zoom out on the scope and work in here. So the only problem with this technique is that it's not as precise as, for example, what we did in Bitwig, and not even as precise as using something like Xfer LFO tools, or even just resampling the whole bass line and just like shortening the notes one by one, as samples. But in a nutshell, this is how we can fix it using classic audio sidechain. So the sidechain here is going to go from the kick and pre-effects, just like I did with Bitwig, basically before any processing and before the mixer's fader. And here, I'm going to set the attack to the fastest possible, and I'm going to set the release, I'm going to keep it to 0.2, like we really want it just to take this small portion of the sound down, right? And just like I did with Bitwig, I'm going to turn on the EQ in here, keep it on a high pass filter, and I'm going to set it to somewhere maybe like 600, 500, 600 hertz, somewhere over there, Just leave the bass notes outside of the sidechaining compression, right? And now what I have to do is basically take down the threshold and start compressing till we take these overlapping notes out, basically. You'll see it's not as precise, but it'll get the job done. Check this out. So we have to go really wild to a point that it'll start affecting the other notes, right? So let's give it a bit more high passing, And since it's taken down way too much, we have to give it some makeup gain, maybe a couple of decibels. The thing with the glue compressor is that whether you like it or not, it's going to affect the sound a little bit, but it does a way better job than what the classic compressor of Ableton does, because that one will actually add like a little bit of clicks, and I don't like that. Let me show you real quick. Okay, so we have the same configuration here as the glue compressor, kick, pre-effects, EQ 600 hertz, and when I start compressing, listen to the clicks it's going to produce. Like you can take these clicks off by giving it a little bit more attack time, but then the bass line, even if we don't really see it on the scope, you know that it's going to bleed a little bit, it'll affect the transient, because it's a matter of milliseconds with these transients. So yeah, I prefer, if I really have to, using the glue compressor in here, and I prefer, like, if you can use an LFO tool or in worst cases, just resample the whole bass line. But yeah, I think, a glue compressor does a better job, and yeah, you just have to compensate for the coloring of the sound, like you have to give something for another one, So yeah, this is how you basically fix the notes overlapping with the kicks issue. Let's go back to the tutorial. And yeah, in a nutshell, this is how I go about creating a bassline in the Neutron, and this is how I process it inside of Ableton or Bitwig using only native devices from both of these softwares. Now, if you like these bass lines and you want to have them in your track, or you just want to go more in details about all of the processing using these devices, whether it's in Ableton or in Bitwig, I've already created several devices with several flavors from the Neutron. You can find them on my Gumroad, so go check that out. And this is one of the best ways to support this channel and, get more tutorials like this. And yeah, this is the end of this tutorial. I really hope you've liked it. I really hope you've learned something new. See you next time.